Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on U.S. EPA's final Clean Power Plan and interstate trading options. My name is Clint Woods. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Air Pollution Control Agencies, or APCA. We've got a great panel to talk about the final Clean Power Plan and what states may want to be looking at in terms of interstate trading. Before I turn it over to them, I wanted to just mention a couple things at the beginning in terms of housekeeping and logistical items. We're very glad to be co-hosting this webinar with the Council of State Governments and the National Center for Interstate Compacts. For those of you who don't know the three organizations co-hosting this webinar, the Council of State Governments, CSG, is the nation's only organization serving all three branches of state government. They're based in Lexington, Kentucky, and the Council is a region-based forum allowing for exchange of ideas between states. The CSG's National Center for Interstate Compacts is a policy program at CSG that assists states in developing interstate compacts and builds on more than 75 years of promoting multi-state solutions. You can find out more about both those organizations at www.csg.org. And our association, APCA, is a consensus-driven organization of state and local air quality regulators. We're focused on technical issues with the Federal Clean Air Act. We currently have 18 state environmental agencies that sit on our board of directors, and these states represent about 40% of U.S. population and GDP and about half of electric power production and consumption in the U.S. So obviously have a great interest in the Clean Power Plan. It's worth noting that our association has not taken a position on the desirability of the proposed or final Clean Power Plan or any particular compliance option for states. You can find out more about APCA at www.cleanairact.org. So just a couple of housekeeping items for everyone. First of all, the webinar today is scheduled for 90 minutes. So we'll take questions at the end after our three presentations from our four experts. The speaker bios for each of those individuals are available on CSG's eCademy website. So we're providing a brief one-by-one introduction for those folks, but you can read more about their backgrounds there. At any time, you can type in questions in the bottom right-hand corner of your webinar screen, and we'll save the majority of those unless they're truly clarifying questions until the end of the presentations. And the presentations and video versions of the webinar will be available a few days after the webinar, and I think everyone who's registered will get an email alerting them to the availability of that video. So I just wanted to, before turning things over, I think we've got a diverse group of folks who either work with or at different elements of state government, including state environmental agencies, public utility commissions, legislatures, energy offices, and in light of EPA publishing the final Clean Power Plan in the Federal Register last Friday, there's been great interest, I think, around the country about this issue, and EPA, in their final Clean Power Plan that was originally released in early August, regulates under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act existing electric generating units or power plants and regulates greenhouse gases. One of the key changes that was in the final Clean Power Plan, among a number of other additions and revisions, is to promote in a number of different ways interstate and intrastate trading, including trading-ready model rules that EPA has proposed, as well as a proposed federal plan that embraces and encouraging interstate trading options. We've got an excellent panel who has been spending months and years on this rule, and for those of you who haven't had a chance to dig into the full 1,600 pages in the final rule, I think they'll provide some excellent background for what their organizations think and what states may want to be considering or not considering as they consider exactly how to respond to this final regulation. So our first speaker is Gary Helm, who's the lead market strategist in the Emerging Markets Department at PJM Interconnection. I think Gary's going to be providing a little bit more background about PJM, but they are a regional transmission organization that serves all or parts of Delaware, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. So I'll go ahead and turn things over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Clint, and appreciate the invitation from CSG and APCA to talk today, because I think what I want to do, at least over the next few minutes, is really give PJM's perspective on the rule and the use of trading. PJM as a whole, we don't comment on, say, the needs for a rule. We just look at, as far as when public policy is presented to us, We just look at what the impacts may be on the grid. And so that's the vantage point we're using for our analysis and this presentation. So you go to the next slide, please. So one key message out of all this is PJM operates, in all the states and DC, as Clint had mentioned. We are responsible for the high voltage grid and mainly the reliability of that grid, as well as looking at the use of markets to maintain reliability and provide energy, as well as planning the grid. And so those are our main focus here. Another thing to point out from this slide is the amount of energy that's generated in PJM, roughly 800,000 gigawatt hours a year. Lastly, the main point here is that PJM is part of a larger interconnected system, so the Eastern Interconnection. We are interconnected with our neighbors, and so when we're thinking about complying with the final rule, the Clean Power Plan, I would like everyone to keep in mind the interconnected nature of the grid. Next slide, please. So before I get into the Clean Power Plan exactly, just to give you a little vantage point from our view and what's happening in PJM and what impacts our thoughts on this. PJM basically sits right on top of the Marcellus and Utica shale plays. So this has had a large impact on our operations and the way we see the system going forward. So again, thinking about the Clean Power Plan and the targets and what may happen in the future, just the fact that we sit on top of all this natural gas is very important. A number of us from PJM just went out in the past week to northern Pennsylvania to a drilling site just to see what was involved with the shale gas drilling and get a handle on the availability of supply and how things are working. If you could go to the next slide, please. One of the things, the main thing that we're finding is, which this story is well known, is cheap gas. But more importantly, the expectation that this gas will be cheap for many years to come. I mean, that colors what is happening with the Clean Power Plan, from the proposal to the final rule to how states may comply with that rule. This is basically the elephant in the room that has the largest impact on all of this. Additionally, is things such as rig productivity that you can see the two lines that shoot up the steepest are Marcellus and Utica, where they are able to, one, not only drill these wells more rapidly, but also the production is becoming more and more efficient. So I think the biggest holdup right now is actually midstream infrastructure, getting the gas out to where it needs to go. The next slide, please. The other thing that is happening, which you're all probably aware of, is electricity demand growth has basically flattened out. So yes, there is still growth happening, but you used to be able to count on 2% growth a year. That is no longer the case. What we have seen in the last many years is a decline in that growth rate, where we're sitting now at about 0.8%, so less than 1% of annual load growth. And so what this means is that there, or at least in PJM, we have ample resources because the grid was planned in past years and our markets were used to secure resources to meet that load growth. And if that is flattening out, you have that load is competing over, I mean, that capacity resources are competing over less and less load. So it makes things more competitive in our marketplace, which does impact our resource mix. Next slide, please. And so what has happened in PJM, we operate capacity market which secures resources 3 years in advance for 1 year. So this is to ensure that we know what resources are going to be available in the future, a way of maintaining reliability in our system. And so what we have found that recently, beginning with the basically advent of shale gas, we saw a decline in coal resources, as well as environmental regulation, where we had back in 2011 the Mercury and Air Toxics Standard. That rule saw immediately after that, when we had an auction for capacity 3 years forward, we saw a decline about roughly 7,000 megawatts of coal that did not clear. So the important thing to know here is that coal resources are under pressure. Natural gas resources have been increasing. And so our expectation in the future, based on the results of our capacity auction, is we're going to have a lot more gas on the system. And this, again, important to note when you're considering complying with the Clean Power Plan and what resources are going to be available to do that. Nuclear has been pretty stable over that period. Over the last 2 auctions, we saw a slight dip in nuclear resources. Again, they are being challenged by cheap natural gas. And so where they used to be market takers, where they could operate all the time, they're now being challenged by cheap gas, and for some of them it's difficult to meet their operating costs. Also of this, solar, wind, renewable resources, a small part of our grid resources at this point. Yes, they are growing rapidly, but you can see it is still minor in comparison to the amount of resources that we're getting, say, from natural gas. And lastly, demand response. We saw a peak in 15-16, kind of leveled off the last couple of years, but demand response future is uncertain, whether that's going to be on the load side or maintain as it is in the wholesale market and on demand. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Next slide, please. All these things are resulting in changing generation mix. And what we're seeing is a growth in natural gas, so where we're actually getting our energy from. And it's over 20% of our energy is being generated from natural gas these days. Coal has dropped to below 40%, down around 38%. Nuclear is still hovering around 33%. Now, the other thing to note, at the top, you're looking at renewables. Again, we're not getting a lot of energy from renewables. And I do want to just point that out because of how the Clean Power Plan, the final rule, is structured, where there is a lot of emphasis on renewables to meet targets, the use of renewables there. So when considering plans going forward, states have to consider the availability of those resources to meet the needs. Next slide, please. The other thing I wanted to point out is the emissions decline over the last couple of years because of its growth in gas-fired resources. What we've seen in PJM is roughly an 18% decline since 2005. So this is big because this has happened without a Clean Power Plan. This has happened mainly due to market forces, as well as some emission regulations. When you look at the last few years, which I mentioned earlier, the Mercury and Air Toxics Standard, that gets things in line with that. But I just wanted to point this out because we have been seeing a significant decline in CO2 in PJM. Next slide, please. So the Clean Power Plan itself, and I'm not going to go back into the details of the proposal, but we did analyzed the proposed rule at PJM, and there's some things that carry forward to the final rule that I wanted to point out that we could use for this discussion. Mainly when we looked at we did an economic analysis on the rule, we found when you looked at a regional compliance versus state-by-state compliance, that in total, on average, the cost to comply regionally was less expensive than if states were to do it on a state-by-state basis. And so that's what I wanted to point out with this slide. And looking at it, from left to right, we basically grouped the states in order of the percentage of coal to their state load, where some states meet their needs and then export, like West Virginia is a major exporter of energy from coal-fired generation. So again, these results by themselves point to the consideration of states working together to meet compliance needs to reduce their costs. So you're using your resources to meet the load and keep costs down. And we're not getting into exactly, PJM is not prescribing exactly how you get there, but just pointing out the results of our analysis. Next slide, please. Another thing that an interesting result we found when we looked at the different levels of renewables and energy efficiency and what that would do in each state. So say a state wanted to use renewables and or energy efficiency to meet their targets, basically to reduce emissions from their in-state generation. What we found, because of the nature of the grid where units are dispatched economically, not necessarily on location, what we found is that you could build renewables and energy efficiency in your state, but the reductions wouldn't necessarily come from generating units within the state. And that's what this slide is pointing out, where the blue bars are the amount of renewables and energy efficiency that came online, and the orange and green show the natural gas and coal that was displaced in state because of that. And so we did see that even though if you would like to reduce things in state, there's no guarantee that that will happen based on the nature of the grid. Next slide, please. And so quickly I want to go over, we also did a resource adequacy analysis looking at, okay, will this impact reliability of the grid? And based on units that may have to retire. And in general, we found a number of different scenarios depending on the levels of renewables and the price of carbon. And so we had a range from 6 gigawatts to 32 gigawatts. And as you can see, if we assume the retirements happened over the interim period of the proposed rule, that we really didn't see a resource adequacy issue unless we looked at the 32 gigawatts, so the highest worst case scenario retirement. And then it was basically in 2024 where we would have an issue. But again, these things don't happen by themselves. We have markets that are working all the time. So when you see areas of need in PJM, the market responds with the necessary resources to maintain reliability. Next slide, please. And so this slide I just wanted to show all, based on all those retirements, looking at that, the different thermal violations. And actually this was less than what we saw, considerably less than what we saw in the mercury and air toxic standard. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the one thing I want to point out, our main concern, at least reliability-wise, for the Clean Power Plan is not retirements or potential retirements. It's more maintaining economic dispatch. So we operate based on security-constrained economic dispatch, and the concern is that if there isn't some sort of way for states to reflect the cost of compliance, so that generators bidding into our markets can put in a cost of what it would be to comply. So if they can do that, then we can maintain economic dispatch. We're still dispatching the least cost unit. Then everything, at least from PJM perspective, everything operates as normal. And your reliability is maintained. You don't have to go out to out-of-market solutions. If something else happens, say a state says, well, that's something we're not interested in. We're going to look at more of a command and control where we will limit the number of hours units can operate so they keep their carbon emissions down. Well, what happens is that ends up being an out-of-market solution. It's more akin to, say, a pure environmental dispatch where we're looking at resources that can only be allowed to operate in certain hours. And so then you're basically losing all the efficiency gains from having a regional transmission organization. So that loss of efficiency, you have higher costs. And so when we think about complying with the Clean Power Plan, the ability for the generators to reflect the cost of compliance in both their capacity market offers as well as their energy market offers is crucial. And so how would you do that? And that's where you look at, well, if there's some sort of trading that generators can do that, there's a price on carbon and they know what they need to operate, then that is beneficial, as well as it maintains that economic dispatch and maintains the normal operation of the grid. You don't have flows changing, you don't have different congestion and different issues and having to deal with different transmission solutions if you're changing the flow of that electricity. Next slide, please. And so with the proposed rule, just to look at that, the one thing that we mentioned to EPA is the ability to maintain reliability. So we asked them that we be able to, in certain situations, if a unit is still needed to run, and but the running of that unit would cause a state not to comply for a compliance period, that we have a way that we could maintain reliability and the state would not be in a non-compliant situation. So that's where we looked for a reliability safety valve. In the final rule, you'll see they added that where the state must get EPA approval, and for 90 days emissions are excluded. Is the 90 days enough? I don't know, but it's definitely a start. Next slide, please. And so then, just to compare, to put it in perspective as far as the final rule and the proposed rule, in PJM, you definitely saw a sort of shuffling of the state targets. Overall, the overall PJM target did not change that much, but certain states, definitely the coal-heavy states, have more stringent rules. Those states that are more gas-heavy have less stringent rules, so we did see that change. So depending on what state you're in, your target may be much more difficult. So again, these are the things we look at least in PJM, that sort of begs the question about the ability to trade, and how if we're looking at complying with this final rule as is, how that would be helpful in that the cost could be reflected and economic dispatch be maintained. Next slide, please. And the other thing to point out, this is some analysis that was done by IHS that I just wanted just also point out the variability of the state positions based on the resources in the state, and some may look better off rate-based, some may look better off mass-based, some may be able to do what they're already doing. So in PJM, there is a variety of options that the states may want to take. But again, at least from our perspective and reliability, it would appear if trading between two types of programs is not allowed, that one program amongst all the states, not that all the states would have to agree on a single goal, but that just ensuring that all the states are able to trade with one another, I think would be the best outcome from PJM's perspective as far as maintaining the normal flow of electricity on the grid. Next slide, please. And so as far as going forward, what we're looking at doing is commenting on the federal rule. This is the proposed federal rule that if a state doesn't have a accepted plan with EPA, that they would have to they would get a federal plan placed upon the generation in their state. So commenting on that, as well as we recently received a request from the organization of PJM states and to analyze the rule, which we are in the process of developing basically a modeling plan, what we're going to do, and we're going to respond to that OPSI letter. So that'll be public. So I encourage you to follow that. And what we'll do is the goal there is to provide information on that analysis, basically March-April timeframe, so that states have time before they have to submit their plan in September. And so that's our goal. So I will end it there, and I appreciate the time and look forward to your questions.
Great, thanks so much, Gary. And I think we'll now turn to our next speakers, Sarah Adair and Jonas Monist. Sarah is a Senior Policy Associate, and Jonas is the Director at the Climate and Energy Program for Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Sarah and Jonas.
Hey, great. Thanks, Clint. This is Jonas. I'm going to start off with just saying a few things off the top here and then turn to my colleague, Sarah. So we're thankful to be back. Clint, thanks for the invitation to speak to your members here. Let me just say just off the top, if you aren't familiar with the Nicholas Institute, we are situated here at Duke University. We were created 10 years ago to provide a bridge between the university and those of you and your colleagues across country and state government and in federal government who are working on the pressing environmental challenges of the day. We are not an advocacy group. We don't take positions on these things, but we do put out white papers and other types of information to help make sure that good objective information is available to help inform the policymaking process. So as part of that, with the even before the Clean Power Plan emerged, we've been working with groups of states in the Southeast, and more recently working in collaboration with the Great Plains Institute with some of the states in the PJM service territory to start thinking through the very rapid changes that are taking place in the electricity sector and how the Clean Power Plan and the numerous options available under the Clean Power Plan relate to what's going on in the electricity sector and help state officials think through regulatory options for complying with the rule. Now, I note at the outset that the litigation has started and there's a lot of uncertainty about how this all plays out. We're not involved in the litigation. We don't take a position on that. And really our focus here is if at the end of the day the Clean Power Plan as it exists remains in force and states have to make compliance choices, helping think through what those choices are. So in that spirit, we're going to focus on the trading ready options under the Clean Power Plan, and some of the choices that are still available to all of you to consider if you, whether you're interested in the trading ready approach, and if so, what strategy under the trading ready framework might you want to pursue at the state level. This is background. So in our work with states after the proposal came out, if those of you remember back to the options under the proposal, one of the options was regional trading, multi-state trading programs, but that required direct negotiation amongst the groups that were thinking about partnering together in a market-based system. After agreeing on what that market-based system would look like, each of the states submitting a similar plan, a coordinated plan to the EPA. We did some economic modeling, as did a number of other groups, and when we were presenting this information to the state officials with whom we were working, there was the modeling in general showed that you would expect to see lower overall compliance costs under a multi-state approach and a market-based approach than you would if states went it alone. Now, caveat that with the economic impacts vary by state because the state targets vary and the state electricity sectors vary, but overall you would expect to see lower overall compliance costs. But couple that with some of the political hurdles to a market-based approach to the Clean Power Plan and the administrative hurdles of explicitly designing a market-based system. A number of the people that we were working with really didn't think that was a viable option. So we and a number of other groups independently started thinking through what the alternate strategies would be. And that type of engagement with the states is really what led to the EPA's approach to the trading ready compliance strategies. And at its heart, the trading ready approach means, if groups of states make similar choices about whether trading can happen, if so, what can trade, and how to track the compliance instrument, then the operators of power plants that are subject to the rule could choose to engage in market-based approaches without the state having to design the market and without the state even having to endorse the market, just making it available among the suite of compliance strategies. And for some states, that may be the least cost compliance, is to grant that broad spectrum of flexibility to covered entities. So with that background, I'm going to turn now to Sarah to go into some of the details about what trading ready actually looks like and some of your considerations you may want to put on the table as you evaluate it.
Great. Thanks, Jonas. So as Jonas mentioned, and kind of based on this interest that we've been hearing from states in the trading ready pathway, I'm going to spend just a few minutes expanding on what some of those considerations that we've been hearing from states with regard to whether to trade and whether to use the trading ready approach in the first place. And then I'll talk a little bit about how trading ready would actually work as EPA lays it out in the math-based and rate-based model rules that were proposed in August. And as I do that, I'll talk a little bit about what we see as some of the key choices that remain for states to make within those frameworks, to the extent that states do use the model rules as a jumping off point for state plan development. And I'll just note here, I think it's been alluded to a couple times, but perhaps not said explicitly here, that the EPA's proposed federal plan for any state that chooses not to submit a plan or that submits a plan that does not get approved is to implement one of these two model rules in the state with some minor differences between what the states might do themselves and how the EPA would implement it. So some key themes that have come up in discussions with states and other stakeholders around trading, and we've heard a lot of these already. First, electrons don't stop at state borders. So we just heard a lot about this topic from Gary at PJM, and I won't say much more about it here other than to point out that even in areas that don't have a regional transmission operator like PJM, utilities manage resources across state borders, and preserving that flexibility is an important consideration. Second, as both Gary and Jonas pointed out, wider markets tend to lower overall costs, maybe not for every state, depending on their situation, but system-wide, we tend to see lower costs with wider markets. Third, trading allows for units to access an additional supply of allowances from outside the state. If demand growth or generation growth is high, and this is something we've heard from perhaps a minority of states that see potential for significant load growth associated with maybe a large influx of industrial customers or some other source of new demand that might be on the horizon. So to the extent that significant load growth does materialize in some states, having access to a wider market for compliance beyond the state's borders could be helpful. And lastly, along the same lines, having access to a wider market can help in the case that there are units that need to run for reliability reasons and need additional allowances to stay in compliance. And on this point, something that's come up in recent discussions is the potential value and actually having some geographic diversity in the emissions trading market. So a lot of the conversations about trading up to this point have focused on consistency and flexibility across neighboring states where electricity flows across borders, but weather patterns, for example, tend to be regional. So if you get an event like a polar vortex that creates a lot of electricity demand and a need for additional allowances in one region, there might be some benefit in having linkages to other areas of the country that aren't experiencing, for example, the same type of weather pattern. Next slide. Okay, so we've heard a lot about why states might be interested in trading and trading ready in particular. What does it actually look like? I'm going to talk about how trading ready works as EPA lays it out in the model rules, and then what we see as the big questions that states would still need to answer within this framework. And I'm going to talk about the math-based model rule first. So quickly, here's how this works in general. I know it's old news for many of you, but the state plan creates a number of allowances in each compliance period, and that number of allowances is equal to the state's total emissions budget. One allowance is equal to 1 short ton of emissions, and the plan establishes a tracking system, as Jonas mentioned, for those allowances, which is essentially kind of the bank accounts for entities that need the allowances for compliance and any other entity that might be participating in the market. And the plan establishes a method for getting those allowances out into the market in the first place, for example, through auctions or giving them away for free. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. To comply, affected units measure their emissions during each compliance period, and they have to surrender 1 allowance for every ton they emit at the end of the compliance period. And the fixed number of allowances in the system is what ensures that the total number of emissions within the system don't exceed the budget. Next slide. So the model rule provides some specifics on how this framework gets implemented, but it leaves some options open for the states. It's customizable. The budget that the model rule uses is a budget for existing sources only that the EPA calculates for each state in the final rule. So there's a number you can go look up for your state. You might recall that the EPA also calculated a budget for existing and new sources for each state. That's a new source complement that we've been hearing about. States could use that budget instead if they wanted to, or states also have some ability to propose changes to either the new source budget or the existing source only budget that EPA proposes, but then those changes would be subject to EPA approval. So there's some extra work involved in if you want to make changes to what that emissions budget looks like. And of course, 1 allowance is equal to 1 short ton of emissions. The model rule specifies that allowances accepted for compliance in the state include allowances from any state with a similar EPA-approved trading ready plan. So this is what Jonas mentioned, and this is the statement that really makes the model rule trading ready. It's simply the provision that allowances from outside the state's borders can be used for compliance within the state. And then what enables those allowances to be traded across state borders is my next bullet point, the tracking system. And in the model rule, it uses the EPA's existing allowance tracking and compliance system, which is a system that EPA already uses in other contexts and has said that they will make available to states for this purpose. So So using the EPA tracking system would facilitate trading with any other state that's using that EPA system, including any state that's given a math-based federal plan. However, states don't have to use the EPA tracking system. They could develop their own tracking system individually or with a group of states, and then to the extent that those tracking systems get linked to other states is what would facilitate trading among different sets of states. Okay, so my last bullet point here is allowance allocation, and this is a really big topic that I won't get into too much today, but perhaps to just point out that it's really important. So this is the big question that states will have to make in a math-based trading plan. Allowances have value, they can be bought and sold, and because they have value, how you get them into the market has really important consequences for how that value gets distributed. So broadly speaking, I already said states have two options for getting those allowances into the market in general. They can auction or sell the allowances and use them for use the revenue for some state policy goal. For example, the RGGI states in the Northeast auction most of their allowances. They sell them to affected entities and others that participate in those auctions, and they invest most of the revenue in clean energy programs. That's one option that's the route that states could go down. Another option is to give the allowances away for free, in which case the question becomes, who do you give them to and on what basis do you do it? And that free allocation option is what's in the proposed model rule. So EPA lays out one method of allocating allowances that states could adopt but don't have to adopt. And this is the method that EPA is proposing that they would use in any state that ends up with a federal plan, if they have to make that decision for the state. Although there is a provision that states that end up with a federal plan could take over the allowance allocation and make a different decision than EPA makes in the model rule. So the bullet points at the bottom of this slide kind of summarize what the EPA would do if they were allocating allowances for the state, or what's actually in the model rule. And that's to give most of the allowances to affected units based on their historic generation from 2010 to 2012. So notably, this is generation, it's not emissions, so it favors natural gas, which has fewer emissions and needs fewer allowances per unit of generation. And the rest of the allowances would be allocated through three set-asides. And a set-aside is just a separate pool of allowances that get pulled out of the state's budget and allocated on a different basis. So the three set-asides in the model rule are listed here. The first pulls out some allowances for the early action program that you might have heard about, called the Clean Energy Incentive Program. That set-aside goes away after the first interim compliance period. It's just there at the beginning to fill a pool of allowances that go to wind and solar and energy efficiency if states participate in that early action program. The second set-aside is for something called output-based allocation to natural gas. This set-aside would allocate additional allowances to natural gas units that operate at a high capacity factor, so it provides an incentive to increase generation from existing gas units. And the third set-aside is for renewable energy, and like that output-based allocation set-aside for gas, it provides an incentive for additional renewable generation. And you'll notice there are asterisks on those last two set-asides on my slide for the natural gas and the renewable energy set-asides. And there's a note at the bottom that these are part of the leakage demonstration. So if you haven't heard about this leakage issue yet, it's important to note that for math-based plans, the EPA is now requiring that states address the incentive to shift generation and emissions from existing sources that are kind of within the 111D framework to new sources that might be operating outside the program, and they therefore don't have to hold allowances in order to emit carbon dioxide, so they don't face that added cost. So states can address that requirement either by covering new sources, that's that new source budget that I mentioned earlier, or by adopting these set-asides that the EPA is proposing, or by some other method subject to EPA approval. So that leakage to new sources requirement is kind of a new wrinkle for math-based compliance. It wasn't there in the draft rule. It's an important consideration in the final rule, and I think it's likely to be a key decision point for states that we're going to hear more about. Okay, so that's math-based trading. Next slide. Turning now to the rate-based model rule, I'm going to spend a little bit less time on this one, even though it's more complex. I think it's getting less attention for that reason, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on it today, but just to kind of walk through some of the parallel decision points. So similar to the mass-based context, affected units measure their total carbon dioxide emissions in each compliance period. They would also measure their total generation, and they would calculate their emissions rate in terms of pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. So if the rate is below the standard that applies to their unit, they earn credits. EPA is calling those credits emission rate credits, or ERCs. If their rate is above the standard, the unit owes credits and needs to go out into the marketplace and acquire enough credits to bring the unit into compliance, and they turn those credits in just like they would turn in allowances. Next slide. Okay, so here's how this works in the rate-based model rule. The applicable rates here are separate rates for fossil steam, which is mostly coal, and for natural gas combined cycle units that are specified in the final Clean Power Plan rule. So, and it's important to note here that these are separate rates for coal plants and gas plants, and they're the only trading-ready option in the rate-based approach is to use those separate rates. So, and the final rule also provides something called a statewide blended rate that you might have heard about. If you've heard that your state rate got easier or tougher from the proposal to the final rule, that's what they're talking about. But that blended rate option can't actually be used in a trading-ready state plan. So if you're rate-based trading ready, you're using these subcategory specific rates for coal and steam. As I mentioned before, the compliance instrument in a rate-based approach is an emission rate credit, which represents 1 megawatt hour of generation that gets added to the unit's denominator from a qualifying resource, which includes renewable energy, new nuclear, energy efficiency. Similar to the mass-based context, what makes this model rule trading ready is that it specifies that credits are accepted for compliance. Credits that are accepted for compliance in the state include any credit from a state with a similar EPA-approved plan. So the state accepts credits from outside its borders. And the rate-based model rule uses the same tracking system as the mass-based model rule, the EPA's allowance tracking and compliance system, but just like in the mass-based context, states could also develop their own tracking systems. And lastly, the big question for rate-based plans is my last bullet point on this slide, the credit issuance process. So the Clean Power Plan specifies categories of resources that are eligible to be issued these credits, but states are responsible for setting up the administrative infrastructure to make that crediting system work. So unlike allowances, which are created by the policy and there's a fixed number of them, emissions rate credits have to be created by qualifying activities. They have to come from somewhere. So that's generation or energy savings from qualified sources. And that generation or savings has to be monitored, it has to be verified. So in the rate-based context, there's a lot of work here on this last bullet point for the state to actually issue ERCs before they ever get into the tracking system where they can be traded and used for compliance. Next slide. Okay, so just to wrap this up, I want to circle back to some of those key decision points that I've already mentioned. So first, Jonas mentioned this at the outset, whether to allow trading across state borders in the first place is a big decision point for states. And to the extent that states are interested in trading, whether to pursue a trading ready plan or a formal multi-state plan, which was the only option in the proposed rule, but is still an option in the final rule, is a first order question. So administrative simplicity definitely favors trading ready, but there may be some reasons why a multi-state plan is attractive for some states, such as having certainty about who the other trading partners are, for example, and that's the extent that states want to preserve this trading option. Another key question is rate or mass. Allowances and ERCs are not interchangeable, so the choice of rate or mass is wrapped up in this choice about whether to trade and with whom. In a rate-based plan, as I've already mentioned, the big to-do is to develop the process for issuing ERCs, which involves a relatively lengthy to-do list from an administrative standpoint and maybe some uncertainty about what that ERC supply would actually look like. And then finally, in the math-based approach, key questions that I think are interrelated is, how do you address leakage? Do you cover new sources? Do you use the allowance allocation method that's in the model rule or some other approach? And then how do you get your allowances out into the market? So with that, I'm going to stop. I'll turn to Jonas to see if he has any final remarks before we pass it over.
As is often the case, I have nothing to add to what Sarah said. I think she covered it well. So we're happy to take questions, but for the sake of time, we'll pass it on here.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And I think on the slideshow there, we've got a few additional resource slides that will be available after the presentation for folks to take a look at as well. But I'll go ahead and turn to our last presentation from Matthew Larson, who's an associate with the Denver firm of Wilkinson Barker Nauer, LLP. And thanks for being here, Matt.
Thanks, Clint. This is Matt Larson at Wilkinson Barker Nauer. Appreciate APCA and CSG putting this together to talk about what is quickly becoming the compliance pathway du jour when it comes to the Clean Power Plan. And appreciate the perspectives of both of the speakers that led off. I think there's a lot of really valuable information there. So we could flip to the next slide. This is a quote from the Clean Power Plan that I've used, and we've been working, my colleagues Ray Gifford and Greg Sopkin, we've written fairly extensively on these Clean Power Plan issues. And this quote to me really jumped out of the 1,500, 2,000 total pages that were part of the rule, because it is pretty obvious that what EPA has done and a number of the tweaks that were made in the final rule, particularly with regard to the de facto authorization of the trading ready approach, is an effort to create a nationwide cap and trade scheme. And I think this quote really goes to that point, and want to draw your attention to it, because I think to the extent that we will see, I do think we will see some group of states potentially not ultimately submit anything. They may come in for an extension, but I think among the states that do make an attempt at compliance, we will see probably almost exclusively trading schemes. And to, again, coming back to some of Sarah's points from earlier, the difficulties of rate-based trading, it just seems like it is going to be a mass-based approach. If you go to the next slide. So some of the issues just with carbon trading generally that I want to flag at a high level, and then we'll dive into a few of the other ones in more detail. And Ray and Greg and I have actually just put out a white paper last week delving into particularly the political economy issues and issues surrounding state legislation and the state measures compliance approach that go into these in much more detail than I'm going to have time to do today. So to the extent that would be of interest to anyone, please reach out to Clint, or you can reach out to me directly. And a lot of these are rehashing. I think there's a lot of agreement, frankly, between the speakers. I think creating congruency between state currencies and architecture is probably the paramount issue. One thing that's different as between this trading scheme implemented under this rule and trading schemes implemented under previous EPA regimes is that you don't have predetermined blocks of states. And I know EPA has tried to mitigate that and take down some of those issues in its revisions to the rule, but there still is the difficulty where states, as they're working through their rulemaking processes or potentially their legislative processes, which we'll get into shortly, will have to come up with currencies that are consistent with one another, architectures that are consistent with one another, measurement and verification processes that are consistent with one another. Rate-based goals versus mass-based goals are the other difference. I've looked into the rate-based approach in a fair amount of detail, and to me, the difficulty of coming up with effectively the avoided carbon is probably too difficult. I would be very surprised if we saw a rate-based trading scheme. I know at the conferences and on the circuits people are talking about it, but a lot of you on this call are the people that actually have to implement those schemes, which makes you different than me, for example. And I think when it comes to that, there's probably some fatal difficulties associated with that. And for that reason, I think to the extent we'll see trading, we'll see it in the same construct that we've previously seen it in, which is in that mass-based construct. The next point is, and one of the reasons EPA is selling trading as the compliance pathway that it would like to see and that it thinks is the most appropriate, is this idea that the Western interconnection states and the Texas interconnection states have headroom. I want to hold that thought. The other things we're going to touch on here in my presentation are political economy issues that are going to be inherent in these trading schemes, the potential need for state legislation to author trading, but really the more important point to my mind is the want for state legislation to authorize trading and some of the benefits that might be there. And I probably won't go into the federal rule too much. Sarah did a great overview of that, and that was, that's certainly out there, and I can completely agree with Sarah that to the extent states say no, that is what they will see as their federal plan. So go to the next slide, please. I bring up this headroom point because I think it's important as we're working through these issues at the policy level to be skeptical of this point. I think a lot of the points that are made about trading in terms of being the cheaper compliance option are valid. I think that's right. I think that's consistently what we've seen within the environmental regulations over time. But I have a major issue with this talking point in terms of that this favors trading. And I think what EPA has done is they've gone through, everyone on the phone I'm sure is overly familiar with the calculation process that went through in terms of coming up with the subcategory specific performance standards. But because of some of the assumptions and inputs, particularly with regard to building block 3, which are extremely aggressive assumptions, we came out with dramatically low coal-fired EGU emission rates in the Western interconnection and the Texas interconnection. I think 1305 is difficult to go get at the stack. I think 360 and 237 don't even register in terms of plausibility. And because of that, anytime that you're coming in with, premised upon the idea that there's all this necessarily built-in headroom as between 360 and 1305 between the Western and the Eastern, and 237 and 1305 as between the Texas and the Eastern, I think that because of those assumptions and the way those assumptions came out, EPA tossed out those two numbers for a reason and went with the 1305 and the 771 because those were the only ones that really could pass the smell test, in my view, in terms of implementing them at the stack. So if you go to the next slide. So I think political economy issues are something that haven't been talked about, but I think they need to be addressed as states are working through their public processes and respective stakeholder processes and coming up with whatever their compliance approach is going to be. And I think, we have, using my home state of Colorado, for example, in Colorado we have 2 investor-owned utilities. Then we have a series of munis, and then we have a number of rural co-ops who not entirely, but almost exclusively fall under the tri-state generation and transmission umbrella. And what we've seen is because of previous legislation here in the state of Colorado, Xcel has fuel switched a great majority of their fleet. Black Hills, who operates in the southern part of the state, is completely gas and renewables, and that's all pursuant to state legislation that we did. So those guys have a huge jump in terms of going out to and getting the emission reductions that they need. They didn't get everything they want, and some of that's because of the way that the baseline was set up, but they do have a head start. To the contrary, the munis and the co-ops, and Tri-State in particular, have done very little. They have not seen the fuel switching that they have. That the IOUs have. They have not seen the renewable expansion partly because they're subject to a lower renewable portfolio standard than the IOUs are. So what we're going to be faced with is two of the largest utilities, largely representing the urban parts of the state, who have already done a great deal, and then you have the rural customers and some of the city customers, including Boulder if their municipalization goes through, but that's a subject for another call. But we'll see that there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure, I think, to get these urban customers to subsidize the emission reductions that are going to be needed in the rural areas and amongst the munis because they are so coal-centric. I think there'll be pressure to distribute allowances in certain ways. I think there'll be pressure for free allowances to be given out. So I don't think this is going to be, in terms of implementation at the state level, because of these kinds of situations, as straightforward as it might otherwise be, because I think those pressures are going to be there, and these different groups of favored constituencies, so to speak, are going to have pressure, will put pressure brought to bear on regulators and put pressure brought to bear on politicians to distribute those allowances in a way that is more equitable in their view. And I think the ultimate result of that is it looks a lot like universal service in the telephony and increasingly in the broadband context, where urban customers cross-subsidize deployment and development in the rural areas of the state. And that's a particular issue in the West, where we have the bigger spaces and the more centralized populations, and then broader urban areas. I think spectrum markets in the telecom context also provide some guidance here. We've seen a great deal of favoritism and pressure to have favoritism within those auctions and within those marketplaces, and I don't think there is any reason to expect that we will not see anything else or anything dissimilar from that as mass-based CO2 trading is coming about. And then one last point, this is an interesting finding by a Resources for the Future study from 2009, but it talked about vertically integrated states in particular. And this is not an issue, clearly, for PJM and restructured markets, and may not, for those of you that are in the East, may not be as big of an issue because you don't have as many vertically integrated states as we do, although you do them down in the Southeast. But what RFF found as they were taking a look at this was the existence of PUC rather than participating in the markets as robustly as they might. To be sure, they still did, but there was also a significant amount of pressure just to fuel switch because it was a lot easier. You can recover your decommissioning costs from customers, you can require your capacity replacement costs from customers, and it provides a known path forward that they appeared to be, at least what the econometric analysis showed, was that they were more comfortable operating within that scheme than perhaps in a trading market that's still nascent and still getting up to speed. I don't know whether we will see that again. Some states like Colorado and Nevada and others have already implemented fuel switching legislation, so maybe some of that risk is mitigated, but it's hard to tell at this point. That's something to be on the watch out for and something to consider from where all of you sit as you're taking a look at developing these schemes. So next slide, please. So, and I'm sure most of you on the call here are familiar with the two types of plan approaches that are contemplated, but quickly, there's the emission standard approach, and then there is the state measures approach. And the emission standards approach I would categorize, broadly speaking, as more of a traditional Clean Air Act regulatory paradigm. You put the emission standard in the permit at the stack, and then effectively you go get it. The state measures is something new, something different that we haven't seen before, but seems to be an offshoot of the state commitment approach at some level that was talked about in the proposed rule, but then went away in the final rule. And basically what state measure says is that if there are certain types of programs that are implemented at the state level through state law, those will not become federally enforceable, even to the extent that they're included as a part of a state plan that is ultimately approved by EPA. And that idea and that state commitment approach was very, very popular, it seemed like, in comments. And it seems like this is an effort to maintain that construct. But the key point of state measures that they do have to be enforceable under state law. So there needs to be state legislation underlying them. And that creates an interesting issue with regard to trading. I think that there is a good argument that you need to pass state legislation in any event to implement a trading scheme. I certainly see the counter argument to it in terms of bringing it in administratively as a federal rule. But I want to set that aside because I think what's important is what the benefits are to the extent that you pass state legislation. Because I think if the state trading scheme is implemented via state legislation, then the trading scheme itself qualifies as a state measure under the EPA's approach. And what that means is that there's a number of benefits that can inure to you. And I don't think you would have to have the full trading scheme necessarily implemented. I mean, RGGI certainly provides a model for that in terms of putting into statute, a significant amount of detail. Their model rule is very high level. I think you could just have some kind of authorization and then do it at an administrative level and still be able to retain the argument that it's a state measure. But for that state measure, once you have removed yourself from the federal enforcement context, there's some pretty big benefits for market participants there, and some pretty big benefits in particular for electric generation unit owners, or to the state, to the extent that the state has the wherewithal or ability to pick up some of the compliance obligation. And once you're not federally enforceable, I think you've taken yourself out of the Clean Air Act enforcement scheme. I think the fine regime that is in place would no longer apply to state measures. I think EPA has been pretty clear about that in the rule, that it's not explicit, but it is saying that there will be no federal enforcement of any of those state measures. And I know that in the rule they are talking about, and most of the discussion centers around pre-existing renewable portfolio standards or energy efficiency targets that are codified under state law, and both pre-existing ones as well as encouraging states to go and implement those types of things to allow for compliance. But I think the idea of bringing your trading in under state legislation to take on the significant benefit that is associated with having a state measures approach is a really worthwhile consideration. I'd encourage you to take a look at our paper, sort of walking through the legal argument, which I won't bore you with on this call in terms of how it goes about removing you from that enforcement scheme. But I think the state legislation would allow you to come up with your own enforcement scheme, maybe an enforcement scheme that's less onerous than, for example, the $37,500 a day penalty scheme that exists currently under the Clean Air Act and will probably be raised at some point in the future. And coming up with your own enforcement scheme and directing your own enforcement scheme, because this is going to be a nascent trading market. I think some of the issues, from a political economy standpoint, are going to take some time to work through. And I think RGGI provides an example here where, they had a hard time within RGGI at first setting the cap, and they seem to have finally righted it and gotten it right in order to be able to achieve, real carbon emission reductions out there. But they had to go through some growing pains. And I think a lot of these states, particularly to the extent you're doing trading ready and trying to link up with different states in different parts of the country, there's going to be growing pains, and those growing pains could result in non-compliance at some point that is inadvertent. So having removed yourself from the clean air enforcement regime would really have a benefit in that standpoint, because you would have a little bit better and maybe more favorable and not as onerous penalty scheme when you're taking a look at that. So in closing, I guess I would sum it up as follows. I would be highly skeptical of the notion of the headroom argument. I think trading is where we are going to the extent that states come into comply. I think those trading schemes are going to be a little more difficult than people anticipate because of the political economy issues, particularly as between investor-owned utilities and rural electrics. And if you are a state regulator with any kind of control over this process, I would encourage you to take a hard look at the state measures approach, the benefits associated with the state measures approach, and what kind of advantages you can gain by having your trading scheme enacted by state legislation as opposed to putting it through administratively. So with that, Clint, I'll turn it back over to you, but happy to take any questions on anything that I had to say. And thanks for your time.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Matt, and thanks to all four of our presenters. I think that was an extremely helpful description of what states ought to be thinking about. And as a reminder, you can send in your questions there on the bottom right-hand side of your webinar application. We've got a stack of really good ones, and I think we'll start with a question for all of our speakers. And with a little bit of background, I think a lot of states are focused on their near-term requirements under this final rule. They're looking at September 2016 when EPA is expecting an initial plan submittal. And in light of some of the changes that came about in the final rule that really changed when states owe EPA certain documents, in this case, the ability to request an extension, even if you're not pursuing a multi-state plan, but the fact that states are looking at September 2016 to ask for that extension, submit an initial plan. And I guess the question that I have for you all is, EPA has indicated, at least to the APCA membership, that what you put in that plan doesn't necessarily obligate you for the direction that you're ultimately going to go in under the rule, whether it be a multi-state plan or a trading ready approach, that you don't necessarily have to telegraph where you're going to be come 2018. I wanted to see if you all kind of agree with that read, that there's no legal obligation necessarily from what you put in that simpler initial plan submittal in 2016. And I guess secondly, what would you all advise if states are thinking about potential interstate trading arrangements? What activities on a practical matter should they be engaging in to coordinate efforts, either between states or within their states in 2016, 2017?
This is Jonas. I'll be happy to jump in. I think that I have no reason to question your characterization of the EPA's characterization of what's necessary in order to get the extension. It seems like it's a pretty low bar, right? They want to see that there's some activity taking place, and they want the states to essentially submit a progress report. But it seems like they were pretty careful to not have a bunch of owner-specific requirements in there. As far as thinking about interstate trading, one question that we've heard come up in a number of different fora where we've interacted with state officials is a question of how important is it that multiple states do something similar, and if it is important, how do you start building momentum towards making decisions? So who goes first, right? And I think that there are a number of opportunities for state officials to start talking to one another about those issues. Some through the workshops like groups like ours run, some through the internal conversations here that you have with APCA members, or through CSG, for example, NARUC, NASIO, NACA. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for state officials to start working through some of these issues together, and I think that it is worth thinking collectively, even if the states don't come to the table trying to get everybody to agree to a single thing, but to start working through some of these issues together and embracing the resources that are available out there. And to that point, that some states seem to believe that it's probably important that they all do something similar, or they may be concerned about doing something different because their electricity markets interact with one another. It was interesting to hear Matt's characterization of the benefits of the state measures approach. One of the benefits of the trading ready strategy without the state measures is it doesn't put the state's legislature in the position of having to make some of these choices and engaging in the trade-offs associated with specifically designing a trading system. So if it is a goal for policy design, and again, we're agnostic on this point, but if it is a goal for those that are designing these plans to have some consistency with their neighbors, then the trading ready strategies do help streamline that approach.
Yep. Any other thoughts and feedback?
Yeah, this is Matt. I could jump in. With a second Jonas's point and also your point, Clint, that the 2016 requirements are a low bar. I think we've seen a pretty significant rollback from the roadmap approach that was really required under the proposed rule, which really required states to make some binding commitments on a real compliance trajectory in order to obtain an extension. So I guess my thought is states should take advantage of that, and states should work through public processes here in the interim. But there's no reason, even if your state is a state that is all in for the Clean Power Plan and is not one of the 26 states engaged in the so-called dual track model with the legislation running on one side and the other, moving forward with at least looking at a state plan. There's really no reason to commit yourself to anything in that 16, and I think it's a matter of taking the agency at what they've said they will do, and that it is a low bar. I think in terms of developing trading platforms as between states and trying to figure out what other states are going to do, I don't have a great answer for that. I think Jonas hit on some of the issues just in terms of trying to come up with some of the communications process. I do think that a couple things. One is just having transparency in the process and making it a public process. I know Nicholas has done some work with Great Plains Institute, and I don't always agree with everything that comes out of there, but I do applaud how public the process is and the efforts that Doug goes to and everyone else involved with that go to be inclusive and get different viewpoints, and I think it's benefited them. So I think having transparency in the process and to the extent states want to take advantage of this state measures approach, it may be a matter of coming up with model legislation that works, and that sort of marries the trading ready with the state measures with the legislative process and the benefits I talked about. So I think that's also out there in terms of a potential way for states to work together.
Hey, this is Gary Helm. And what we've been asking of states in our footprints is just to think about in going forward. Part of it was the final rule was working with your regional transmission organization on reliability, in looking at any plan. So what we're asking states to do at this point is start thinking about that, at what point of the process they would like to work with PJM. And what we're doing is working with OPSI right now on analysis, but going forward is how what points may we say take a look at plans for reliability, because the thing is it's not only your state but it's also surrounding states. We will end up looking at all the states in our footprint as a whole too, and so coordinating that is going to be an important effort as well. We're starting to meet with states individually. So the final rule just came out. We're scoping our modeling efforts, but we're also beginning to meet with states to talk with them individually about what their thoughts are, you know, what options they feel they have for complying with the rule. Because as far as analyzing the rule, we need input from the states as far as, you know, what they're thinking, you know, what type of resource mix they see that would help them comply, you know, and that helps, you know, provide inputs to our modeling. So that's what we've been asking them to think about.
Great, thanks so much. And I think we've got sort of a related question to the point that Jonas and Matt touched on. But the question is, how can trading-ready plans be considered by states when they haven't been authorized by the legislature? And has that dynamic changed in the final rule and some of the options that are available that weren't perhaps in the proposal? And that's a question for any of the presenters.
Well, this is Matt. I could field it first, and then but I would be interested to get Jonas and Gary and Sarah's viewpoint on it too. I think the inclusion of the model rule does change the calculus a little bit in terms of whether state legislation is per se required. I think the way that the rule was previously set up, there was an extremely strong argument that state legislation was necessary for any trading scheme at all. I think that has been weakened to some extent by the inclusion of the model rule. But again, without going to the legislature and getting that legislative sign-off, it doesn't allow you to take advantage of some of the state measures benefits